second offer. Mr. Knightley was so angry that it was some time before he went to Harfield again. When Emma saw him again, she could see that he had not forgiven her, and she was so sorry about that. But she thought her plan was succeeding. Every time Mr. Elton met Harriet and Emma, he sighed a little more, and Emma was certain he really did love Harriet. Harriet was making herself a little book of poems, and some of the people she knew had suggested their favorites for the book. One day Emma told Mr. Elton about it, and then she said, "Perhaps you could write something for Harriet's book. You are so clever, it will be easy for you." "I'm sure I couldn't do it," he replied, but the next day he called at Harfield and left a paper with a short poem written on it. It was addressed to Miss. "He means it for you, of course," said Emma. They read the poem together and saw that it was a very pretty love poem. Harriet was delighted with it. "Mr. Elton, he really is in love with me," she said. The poem was read to Mr. Woodhouse, and he said it was probably the best they had found. Then he started talking about Isabella. She's coming next week, and they will all be here for Christmas. "We must ask Mr. and Mrs. Weston to dinner while they are here, Papa, and Harriet must come as often as she can," said Emma. "You love my nieces and nephews," Emma said to Harriet, "and it will be a Christmas to remember." The next day Emma had to visit a poor sick family in the village, and Harriet went with her. The road to their little house passed the church and then later Mr. Elton's house, and for a moment they stopped to look at it. It was the first time Harriet had seen where Mr. Elton lived. "What a sweet house," said Harriet, "and there you and your book of poems will go one day." "Then I shall often walk this way," replied Emma. They continued their walk and visited the family. Emma was a very kind young lady, and she took them food and clothes for the children and tried to help as much as she can. As they started their walk back to Harfield, they met Mr. Elton just as he was coming out of his house, and he asked if he could walk with them. Emma wanted to let Harriet and Mr. Elton walk together without her, and so she stopped and bent down to check her boots. They walked on and seemed to be having an interesting conversation. Emma tried to keep a long way behind, but soon they stopped, turned, and waited for her to catch up with them. She had hoped Mr. Elton might take the opportunity to tell Harriet he loved her, but he didn't. "He is very cheerful," she thought. "He will not tell her until he's sure she loves him." But although she did not succeed with that plan, she was certain they had moved a little closer to the great day of their marriage. Isabella, John Knightley, and their children arrived at Harfield the week before Christmas. Mr. Woodhouse was delighted to see them all again, and the family were happy to be together. They talked about their friends in Highbury, and of course they talked about Mr. and Mrs. Weston. "Do you see Mrs. Weston often?" asked Isabella. "Not as often I would like, and she always goes away again," said Mr. Woodhouse sadly. "But remember poor Mr. Weston. She must go now that she is married, Papa," laughed Emma. "And what about the young man, Mr. Weston's son? Has he been to see his father since the wedding?" asked John Knightley. Everyone in Highbury knew about Mr. Weston's son, Frank, but nobody had seen him before. Several times he had said he was coming, but each time something had happened to stop the visit. Frank's aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, had adopted him when his mother died. He was only a baby, and it seemed to Mr. Weston at the time that it was the best thing to do. The Churchills had no children of their own, and Frank took their family name. But Mrs. Churchill was very jealous and wanted to keep Frank for herself. Although Frank saw his father once a year in London, he had not yet met his new wife. If Frank Churchill finally did come to Highbury, it would be very exciting for Mr. and Mrs. Weston, and for the whole village. Everybody looked forward to meeting him, especially Emma. Mr. Woodhouse told Isabella, "I have seen a letter he wrote to Mrs. Weston, and he seems a very pleasant young man. I'm only sorry, but he's not here now, so that you can meet him, my dear. Mr. Weston invited all the family to Randalls for dinner on Christmas Eve, and Harriet, Mr. Knightley, and Mr. Elton were asked to join them. 2 carriages were going from Harfield, and Mr. Woodhouse arranged to meet Mr. Elton at his house and take him to Randalls with them. The day before, Harriet became ill with a cold and a bad throat, and so she could not go. Emma explained to Mr. Elton, and he said he was very sorry that Harriet was ill. Emma thought he might be so unhappy that he would not go to Randalls without Harriet, but he surprised her. It's a pity our friends cannot join our little party, but I'm looking forward to the evening, he told her. We must hope she will soon feel better. Emma thought it strange that he was not more worried, but she said nothing. During the journey he was so quite happy, and even joked a little. He seemed to have forgotten poor Harriet, and was abusively enjoying himself. When they arrived at Randalls, Emma was surprised to find Mr. Elton at her side most of the time. She heard Mr. Weston telling the others something about Frank, but because Mr. Elton was talking to her, she could not hear everything. Emma had an interest in Frank Churchill, although she had never met him. They were about the same age, and because their 2 families were now joined in marriage, it seemed to her that he was the man she should marry. She thought Mr. and Mrs. Weston had probably had the same idea, perhaps her father also. At dinner she was seated next to Mr. Weston and far from Mr. Elton, so she had a chance to ask about Frank. "I should like to see 2 more people here tonight, your friend Miss Smith and my son," he said. "Did you know we had another letter from him this morning? He will be here with us in a fortnight." Mr. Weston dubbed it, "But I'm sure he will come this time." "If you think he will come, I shall think so too," said Emma. She hoped he was right because she wanted to meet him very much. The evening at Randalls was a very pleasant one, and as they left for home, it started to snow. Mr. Woodhouse, Isabella, and John all rode in the first carriage, and so Emma and Mr. Elton were alone in the second. They had just driven through the gates and reached the road when suddenly Mr. Elton jumped up from his seat to sit next to Emma and took her hand in his. She immediately moved across the carriage. "Mr. Elton, what are you thinking of? Please stop this minute," cried Emma, afraid that he had drunk too much of Mr. Weston's excellent wine. But Mr. Elton would not stop. He said he loved her. He would die if she refused to marry him. Again he moved next to Emma, and again she moved away. "I cannot understand this," said Emma. "Surely it is Miss Smith you love, not me." "Miss Smith? How can you think that?" he asked. "But the painting and the poem. Explain yourself, Mr. Elton. Miss Smith means nothing to me. I thought the artist was wonderful, not the subject, and the poem was for you." Mr. Elton tried to take Emma's hand again. "Miss Smith is a pretty, pleasant girl, and I wish her well, but my visits to Harfield have been for you only." Emma was so surprised that she did not know what to say. Mr. Elton tried to take her hand again. "Your silence makes me think that you always understood me," he said. "Then I see we have both made a mistake. I do not wish you have any interest in me, Mr. Elton, and I do not intend to marry anyone at present." After that they sat silently until the carriage stopped outside Mr. Elton's house, and he got out. They both said a cold good night, and the carriage drove Emma home to Harfield, where the family were waiting for her. Mr. Elton's choice. That night it was difficult for Emma to sleep. For herself, she did not worry about what happened in the carriage with Mr. Elton, but she felt very sad for Harriet. Harriet has grown to like this man, and then to love him, she thought. And it was because of me. She remembered what Mr. Knightley had said to her about him. That day in the garden, Mr. Elton will choose sensibly, he had said, and now it seemed he was right. He had not wanted Harriet, had never thought about her as a wife. All the time it had been Emma he wanted. But she knew the first and the worst mistake had been hers. It was wrong and foolish to try to bring two people together, and she was ashamed of herself. It was enough that I talked her out of love with Miss Martin. There, at least I was right, she thought. The next day Emma was blessed to see a lot of snow outside. This was a good thing because it meant she could not go to church and see Mr. Elton or go to visit Harriet, and none of them could meet. The snow stayed for several days after Christmas, and the only visitors to Harfield was Mr. Knightley. As soon as the snow disappeared, Isabella, John, and the children went back to London. The same evening, a letter arrived from Mr. Woodhouse from Mr. Elton. It said he was leaving Highbury the next day and going to Bath to spend a few weeks with friends. There was no message in the letter for Emma, and she was a little angry about that, but also pleased he was going away. She knew the next thing she must do was to speak to Harriet and tell her everything. Harriet cried, but she did not blame Emma at all for what had happened. They went back to Harfield together, and Emma tried very hard to make Harriet feel better, but she knew only time could help her to forget. Perhaps when Mr. Elton returned, they might all be able to meet without feeling embarrassed. Mr. Frank Churchill did not come. He wrote a letter for excuse, and in it he said, "I hope to come to Randalls quite soon." Both Mr. and Mrs. Weston were very sorry, but they decided perhaps the spring was a better time to visit, and maybe he could stay for a longer time then. Emma gave Mr. Knightley the news and blamed the Churchills, especially his aunt. Mr. Knightley did not agree. If he wanted to see his father, he could come. He's 23 or 4. At that age, it is not impossible. A short time ago, he was in Weymouth, so he can leave the Churchills when he wants to, he said. It might not be easy for him at the time. His aunt and his uncle may need him at home. Why do you dislike him so much? Asked Emma. I neither like nor dislike him because we have never met. But I cannot understand why this is so difficult for him. He seems a very weak young man. We should never agree about that, said Emma. Perhaps he's just kind and gentleman. Perhaps he doesn't want to make his aunt unhappy. He is certainly very good at written letters and making excuses, but Mrs. Weston must feel very insulted because he has not come to meet her. Emma knew Mr. Knightley was becoming angry about Frank Churchill, and she could not understand why. I believe he will come soon, she said, and when he does, everyone in Highbury will be very excited. We are all interested and want to meet him. Oh, I never think of him from one month to another, was all Mr. Knightley said. Emma and Harriet were out walking one morning, and in Emma's opinion had talked enough about Mr. Elton for one day. Harriet could not forget him, and still loved to hear his name. They were near the house where some old friends lived, and Emma decided to visit them may help Harriet to think about other things. After having a nice day with their friends, Emma said, I'm sorry, but we must go now. My father will be waiting for us. Emma and Harriet left the house, although Miss Bates tried very hard to make them stay a few more minutes. They promised to return the next week when Jane was there, and Emma invited Mr. and Miss Bates to come to Harfield with Jane for an evening of music. The evening at Harfield was pleasant, and everyone enjoyed the music. Mr. Knightley was invited also, Harriet and Mr. and Mrs. Weston, so there was quiet and big party. Both Jane and Emma sung and played the piano, but Jane was much better. Emma tried to make conversation with her, but she always found it difficult because Jane was quiet and a little cold. She often seemed unfriendly, and Emma did not know why. Frank Churchill appears. Mr. Elton returned to Highbury happy man. It was not long before everyone knew about his future wife. Her name was Augusta Hawkins, and she came from a family with money. £10,000 was the rumor in Highbury. Emma only saw him once or twice before he went to Bath again, but Harriet always seemed to see him or hear his voice. Everyone said he looked very much in love, and when she heard that, Harriet became more unhappy. One day when they were shopping in Highbury, Emma and Harriet met Mr. and Mrs. Weston. "We have just been sitting with your father," said Mr. Weston. "We wanted to tell you the good news. Frank is coming tomorrow and staying for a whole fortnight. We had a letter this morning, and we shall soon bring him over to Harfield," said Mrs. Weston. They were both very happy, and Emma was delighted. She hoped Mr. Elton might be talked about less when Frank Churchill arrived in Highbury, and was looking forward to meeting him at last. The next day morning, Emma was in her bedroom when she heard voices downstairs, and when she walked into the drawing room, there sat her father with Mr. Weston and his son. Mr. Weston introduced her and explained that Frank had come a day earlier than they thought. He was a very handsome man, and he looked sensible and friendly. She felt immediately that she would like him. As they talked together, Frank asked Emma about herself and Highbury. Did she like walking and riding? Was it a pleasant society in Highbury? Did they have musical evenings and dancing? That evening, Frank returned to Randalls from London. He had his hair cut and laughed at himself for doing it. He was not ashamed, and Emma began to think there was nothing wrong in it after all. There was other news in Highbury that was more important. Some neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Cole, were going to hold a dinner party. The Coles had a large and beautiful house. There was always music there, and there might possibly to dance. On the night of the party, Emma's carriage arrived at the Coles' house behind Mr. Knightley's. "I'm surprised to see your carriage," she said. "You usually walk or ride everywhere, but it's more suitable for a gentleman, so now I should really be very happy to walk into the same room with you." Mr. Knightley laughed at her, and they went into the party together. At dinner, Emma sat next to Frank, and they talked together about society in Highbury. Jane Fairfax sat across the table from them, wondering what they were talking about. Mrs. Elton comes to Highbury. The evening at Mr. and Mrs. Cole's house had been a very happy one. Emma looked back on it and smiled, and so did Frank Churchill. He had enjoyed the dancing so much that all the next day he was thinking of how to arrange more. When Mr. Woodhouse and Emma called at Randalls the next evening, he told Emma his idea. "The dancing we started at the Coles could be finished here at Randalls," he said, "with the same people and the same musician. What do you think?" They thought it was a good idea. Fortunately, a few days before the ball, a letter came from Mrs. Churchill. She was very ill, it said, and Frank must return home immediately. Emma was very upset when she heard the news. All their plans for the ball were ended, and Frank was going away. He came to Harfield to see Emma and her father before he left for home. "Of all the most horrible things, saying goodbye is the worst," he said to Emma. He looked very unhappy. "You will come again," she replied, "but I cannot say when. I shall certainly try, and then we shall have our old ball. And now there is no time to say goodbye to Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax before you go," said Emma. "I did call there on my own way, just for 3 minutes," he said, My father will be here very soon, and then I must leave immediately. Miss Woodhouse, it has been a wonderful fortnight. I shall think of you all and dear Highbury. Mrs. Weston had said she will write with all the news, but until I can be here again. He stopped and looked at Emma, and she thought he must really be in love with me. He was just going to speak again when his father arrived with Mr. Woodhouse behind him, and there was only time to shake her hand and say goodbye before he left. It was sad change for Emma. They had met almost every day that Frank had been in Highbury, and now Emma's life seemed very quiet. That night she wrote in her diary, "I suppose I'm in love with him. I think about him a lot, and everything is so very boring without him." Mr. Knightley was not sorry to see Frank go, but he was sorry that Emma was upset. One afternoon at Rundle's, Emma, Mrs. Weston, and Mr. Knightley were discussing Jane. "Why does she stay here so long?" wondered Emma. "She could go home to the Campbells, and I cannot understand why she prefers to be here month after month." "If she stays, she will have to see Mrs. Elton a lot of time, and I cannot believe she will like that," said Mrs. Weston. "But perhaps she likes to be away from her aunt and grandmother occasionally." Mr. Knightley agreed, "And if there is no other person to be with," he said, looking at Emma, "I know how much you like Jane Fairfax. Perhaps you like her more than you realize." Emma said to him, "Oh, I see what you are thinking of. I'm sure Miss Fairfax would not have me if I asked her, and I'm also sure I will never ask her," he replied. Mrs. Weston touched Emma's foot with hers. Mr. Knightley continued, "So you have decided that I should marry Jane Fairfax, have you?" "Not at all," said Emma. "You were angry with me before for matchmaking, and I had no idea of trying it with you. You would not come and sit with us in this comfortable way if you were married." Emma thought Mr. Knightley might be angry with her if he thought she and Mrs. Weston were matchmaking him with Jane, but she was surprised to see that he seemed a little amused by the idea. "I like Jane Fairfax, of course, but I have never thought of being in love with her, not once," he said. After he had left, Emma said to Mrs. Weston, "Now, what do you think about Mr. Knightley marrying Jane Fairfax?" "My dear Emma, I think he tries too hard to tell us he is not in love with her. I would not be surprised if he was. I may be right in the end," Mrs. Weston replied. The ball at the Crown Inn. Everybody in Highbury wanted to entertain Mr. and Mrs. Elton. Dinner parties and evening parties were arranged for them, and they had so many invitations that they rarely spent an evening at home. Emma knew they must have a dinner at Harfield for them, or people might guess that she did not like Mrs. Elton. It was easy to decide who to invite. The Westons and Mr. Knightley, of course, but there must be an eighth person. This ought to be Harriet. But Emma was not surprised when she said she could not come, and she understood exactly why. Poor Harriet did not yet feel comfortable with the Eltons. So Emma was able to ask Jane Fairfax to be the eighth person at the dinner. She was glad she could do this because Mr. Knightley's words had worried her. He had said that Jane spent time with Mrs. Elton only because no other person asked her. This is very true, thought Emma, and I'm certainly guilty of it. I ought to have been a better friend, and I will try harder now. Everyone replied to her invitation and said they could come, and there was one other surprise guest. Isabella's two eldest boys were coming to stay at Harfield, and Mr. John Knightley was bringing them on the day of the dinner party. So Emma had one extra guest until she lost another. Mr. Weston had to go to London on business and could not be there for the dinner, but he hoped to join them later in the evening. On the day of the party, everyone arrived on time. Mr. John Knightley and his sons had met Miss Fairfax that morning as they were walking home from Highbury, when it had just started raining. Okay, everybody, so this is the end of the second part of the novel. Hope you like it. I really hope you enjoy the video. So tell me in the comments what do you think is gonna happen in the party, and if you didn't subscribe me yet, don't forget to subscribe me and give me a big thumbs up, and of course turn on the bell to get notifications. And if you want to follow me on Instagram, I'll let you the link in the description to make our family bigger. Goodbye. Oh, before I go, I want everybody to watch this video. So I want you guys to share the video with your friends, neighbors, family, I don't know, everybody. Just share it. Okay, goodbye again, and for the last time.